Welcome to the Life with Grief podcast. I'm your host, grief and transformational life coach and fellow griever, Tara Accardo. Hello and welcome back to the Life with Grief podcast. I'm your host, Tara Accardo, and today I want to dig into the topic of delayed grief. And this topic, like many here on the podcast, has been on my mind for a long time, and I actually have a blog post about delayed grief as well, so definitely go check that out on my website. That's all linked in the show notes if you want to read about it instead. But for those who are up for listening today, I have evolved that blog post and just wanted to reintroduce this topic and even enhance it and go into a little bit more detail than I even did in that blog post, just to bring attention to this today, this type of grief, and hold space for it and talk about what it is and how to navigate it and how to cope with it. Because I feel like so many of us, and I can certainly speak for myself in this regard, don't even know that we're going through delayed grief, that we have delayed grief, almost like until after it happens. This one I feel like is just like hindsight's 2020 a little bit, but the more that we can become aware of it and just recognize when it's happening, if it's happening, that will just help set us up for just a little more success in this healing process that never really ends. So also, I really wanted to bring this up because I so often see this in people that I one-on-one coach. I cannot tell you guys how many people have come to me either through one-on-one coaching or just like literally through my DMs or wherever that have expressed to me, you know, like I'm confused. I am lost. Like, why am I just now feeling this grief? Why is it hitting me now, even though it perhaps happened so long ago or whatever it is? And they almost feel shame. They almost feel badly that this grief is like just now coming to them. It's just now coming to the surface. But I just want to start this episode really by validating how common that is. There could be so many reasons why our grief and how it is showing up might feel or seem delayed. So really, with this episode, I just want to help you understand the concept of delayed grief if it's something that you think you might be struggling with, or maybe someone around you. Definitely on this podcast, I want to put episodes and topics out there that, you know, of course, help grievers out there, but this is for supporters too. If you feel like someone around you might not be like recognizing the severity, the depth of something that has happened to them, or you know, whatever this looks like, and it could potentially help you as a supporter or the griever themselves understand what's happening and why and how to cope and how to navigate it. So that's exactly what we're getting into. What delayed grief is, how it can affect us, and how to cope with it. So let me just say this. I mean, grief is something that we expect to feel immediately after a loss, one would imagine, right? Or with anticipatory grief, maybe before the loss has actually like technically occurred. But I've talked about this before on the podcast. Maybe you are watching a loved one's health decline, or you're in the middle of a divorce or something like that, right? It's still kind of this like living loss, if you will. Either way, generally speaking, on paper, we might imagine that our grief is something to be felt soon or immediately, right? As it's happening. But what if you don't? What if it is weeks or months or even years? Yes, even years after, let's just use the example of a loved one dying, years after they die. And then suddenly, or maybe perhaps not suddenly, but like things start coming up to the surface, it just begins to hit you. That is delayed grief. And so, you know, again, take a second here. Imagine you lose someone close to you. And in that immediate aftermath, for example, maybe you are just too busy with practical responsibilities, handling the arrangements of their death, supporting family, whoever that is for you. You are just trying to stay mentally afloat. Maybe you have kids, maybe you have a job. Like you just almost don't have the time or the mental space or capacity to grieve properly. Or maybe your emotions have just felt numbed, right? You're just numbed out. That is where delayed grief can come in. And while immediate grief is often characterized by really intense feelings or emotions, delayed grief can oftentimes be more subtle. It is often simmering beneath the surface. And it's not that it can't just hit us like a tidal wave one day. It absolutely can. But I feel like where the delayed grief starts to come in is it creeps in. I mean, I've said this before. Grief will make itself known. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So this is why I feel like delayed grief is such an important topic, because again, there can be so many, okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. There can be so many reasons for this. We're going to get there. I promise. But it can stem from a variety of factors. High level for right now, that could be that particular griever's coping mechanisms or lack thereof, personality traits that they might have, or the way that they were raised to process grief or not, the circumstances surrounding the loss, the list goes on. I've talked about my experience with anticipatory grief on the podcast before. There is an episode also, by the way, solely on anticipatory grief. Definitely check that out in the show notes. But where I have come to know delayed grief is as my parents died just 6 months apart, I barely had time to grieve my mom before my dad's health really started declining. And this happened like 4 or 5 years ago now as of this recording. And I can take myself back to that time. And it was very surreal, honestly. I don't even think I realized the gravity of what was happening. I actually remember having sort of a come to Jesus moment with myself. I mean, there was a few moments, to be honest. Once when he was first admitted into an ICU, and then he was like never released from a care facility after that. And then sort of again, when he entered a hospice adjacent facility, and then it was like they officially moved him into hospice after that. So there's a few times in his journey that occurred to me, I guess. But where the delayed grief really came in actually was more with my mom's death, I think. And it's because I just didn't have like the time or the mental capacity, because when she died, my dad was already sick. He had prostate cancer, but it wasn't necessarily, at least I didn't know this at the time, it hadn't spread. It itself wasn't getting worse. I just knew my dad was in not a good state of mind, with my mom now being dead. It's his partner for over 35 years. He loved her and missed her dearly, and I can tell he was not himself. So there was a sense of me, I think, that sort of felt like I had to keep him alive, keep him strong, keep him having company around him. And it was just me and my dad here, really. Like, we didn't have any other family here. So although a couple people visited, like, it wasn't that constant long-term support that either of us had via family nearby. So there was a lot of pressure that I put on myself. My dad did not put that on me. I definitely, that was self-inflicted. But I felt, I don't know, I felt like I just had to really be there for him. I had this only one parent left. I wanted to preserve him and keep him around as much as possible. But I definitely remember being scared of like, okay, well, how long is he going to be around now? How long can he live without his wife? Like, what is he going to do? Like, I remember feeling so overwhelmed even thinking about that. And then, but then his cancer metastasized, and that process of him and his health declining really started from there. So, and then I was, in a relationship, and although that relationship did end, and I've talked about that here on the podcast before, it's with my now husband, but at the time we did break up for a period of time, and that's a story for another day. But at the time, just after my mom died, we were still in it, and I was still trying to maintain that. I was still trying to take care of my dog. I was still trying to work. I mean, just when does one have a moment to spare to grieve properly? So I really, looking back, did not fully, or really at all, get to grieve my mom before my dad died. And then, only when I had the chance to take a step back and say, whoa, this is pretty bad. Like, this is really bad. Like, once my dad died, and both of them were gone now. So now I was grieving my mom and my dad and both of my parents as like a little family unit. That's when I was like, oh, this really, really hurts. I am in excruciating amount of pain. And like I said, for, the months prior to my dad's death, like, I wanted to be there for him as fully and presently as I could. And that required time and energy. And it was frankly quite a distraction from the other intense sadness that I was feeling around my mom. But looking back too, I think a big part of me didn't want to grieve my mom yet. Like, it was so shocking that she was gone in the first place. I couldn't even wrap my head around it. So I think this delayed grief was both a coping mechanism and being faced with yet another death and more loss so shortly after. And it just compounded, as grief often does. And I was not in a good place. And it took a lot of the right tools to help me through that. I'm not even going to say out of it, but I would say I'm out of that now, to be honest. I'll never say, we're out of our grief per se. It doesn't work that way. But I will say, that delayed grief has come and gone. I'm fully aware of it now. And I've worked through that. So in this episode, I hope to help you work through that too, as much as possible. But let's shift into the causes of delayed grief. I've touched on a couple of these already, but there could be a variety of reasons that delayed grief can rear its ugly head. And like I said, a couple I just spoke to about in my own journey, but let's just run through some ways that this can show up. So number one, prior trauma. If someone has a history of unresolved trauma, whatever this trauma might entail, that grief can trigger those old wounds, which complicates and delays the natural grieving process. Number two, suppressed emotions. So in some cases, people may suppress their grief due to, oh my God, so many things: societal expectations, responsibilities they feel they have, a need to stay strong for others, whether it is self-imposed or imposed on others, you name it, there could be a way that suppression can happen. In terms of societal expectations, there could be a lot of things here, right? And by the way, we are only scratching the surface with this topic on this episode today, but this could be anything from feeling the need to get back to work quickly, definitely happened to me, being limited by how much bereavement time you have off, also happened to me, the imposition of others' beliefs on how long your grief should last, or when it should come up and when it should leave, and when it's appropriate and inappropriate. And I have a lot of thoughts and feelings on that, but spoiler alert, it is however long you need, okay? This is your journey, your unique grief. Other responsibilities can include, like I said, a family, as I said, in my case, feeling the need to take care of my dad, maybe his kids that are keeping you busy, the list goes on. And these added responsibilities can no doubt add an incredible amount of stress on top of an already very stressful and sad situation. Throughout this process, we may find ourselves needing to, quote, stay strong or put on a brave face, which is very gallant, but we have to be careful because that can be harmful. That can be detrimental when we are actually trying to cope with our grief properly. And yes, it's empowering to be strong and it's empowering to uplift others, but I always want to pause and ask, who is taking care of you? Who is filling your cup? Who is making sure you're okay? And why is this important? Because suppression can lead to delayed grief and even more severe grief. And this isn't to scare anybody. It's just the reality of the situation, because these emotions can resurface later. And as I said earlier, it is not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So something very important to keep in mind. Another reason here could be denial and avoidance. And I've talked about this a lot in some of my blog posts on my website and episodes of the podcast, but simply put, denial and avoidance is not the way to go. But after a loss, many people throw themselves into work or caretaking or other projects. I have said this before, and I stand by this. Healthy distractions are okay. They're like many things in the grieving process. There is a fine line, right? There are things, distractions, I almost hate the word distractions, but for lack of a better term, distractions that can spark joy. And for example, throwing yourself back into work. Okay, maybe, truthfully, I think that's actually why I put myself back into my work a little bit. And I even remember, I've talked about this before, like being at the hospital while my mom was like sleeping and working a little bit. Number one, because I felt like I had to. But number two, I actually think like mentally that helped me like stay sane. I'll be very honest. And it like made it feel like there's a little bit of a sense of normalcy and like not everything was out of my control. So I just want to mention that. I want to hold space for that. And it's okay to work. It's okay to do certain things, but it's all about balance, right? It's like, for me, it's like food. It's like, it's all in moderation, right? With the sweets, we got to get the healthy stuff. So just keeping that in mind and maintaining a balance and knowing when to turning off the work, turning off the distractions. And by the way, I feel like I always need to say this, alcohol, drugs, all of that, not a distraction, not good. Do not avoid with anything like that. When I talk about distractions, I mean healthy things, okay? We just want to be careful. Everything in moderation, as I always say, it's always about a balance. It's all, think about it like diet, right? That's how I always say with like sweets and little treats and stuff, like all in moderation. And I feel like when you give yourself a little bit of that sweet or that little treat, it helps you not binge on the bad stuff because you're always giving yourself like a little bit of what you need. Kind of a funny analogy, I know. But you can almost think of that with like grief and the grieving process and these little distractions, because we do need healthy ones sometimes. So whatever the outlet is, be responsible with it, because certain distractions, and certainly unhealthy ones, can push the grief to the back burner until life slows down or until it just comes back to kick you in the butt. And I promise you, you're going to feel that grief and those emotions and everything you were trying to bury tenfold. So by allowing those healthy distractions in little by little, but also balancing it out with the grief work, with witnessing your grief, with checking in with yourself, with working with someone like me to help you along in that process, that makes for a really good, healthy balance of trying to maintain a sense of normalcy and control in a time that feels very out of control, but also allowing yourself to still live and process and comprehend everything that has happened or is in the process of happening. Again, just touching on that anticipatory grief if something is literally unfolding in front of you right now. That's excruciating. So keep that in mind, okay? Real quick interruption here, and then we'll get back to this episode. If you're someone who is experiencing some form of loss and are trying to navigate the complexities of grief, which you likely are in some capacity if you've stumbled upon this podcast, then this message is for you. If you haven't heard about my Life with Grief membership and community yet, this is truly something you need to check out. This membership is here to guide you into living a deeper, more meaningful, and full life after experiencing loss. Who doesn't want that, right? I created this membership because I know what it's like to navigate and cope with grief on a daily basis, and I know the tools and support it takes to do this effectively. I've done the work myself, and I've coached people just like you to do the same. It comes down to having impactful, effective resources and tools at your disposal, having the right support around you from people who can understand and empathize with your grief, and having encouragement and inspiration around you consistently to not only elicit and spark change, but to keep it and keep the positive momentum going. Check out the details linked in the description, and I hope to see you in there. Next is overwhelming circumstances. So when people face multiple losses or traumatic events in a short time span, definitely my story, and perhaps, unfortunately, sadly, yours as well, that person's emotional capacity to process grief might become overloaded, which results in a delayed emotional response. I have definitely been there. And if you are there right now, or if you have been there, the overarching theme of this episode, I'm just going to interrupt myself, by the way, is grace. It is giving yourself grace. It is giving others around you grace. And it is approaching your grief and all of these circumstances with love and compassion and patience. Because when you break this down, sometimes the brain and the body protect themselves by numbing our emotions. You know, when you lose someone or something, or you're going through a traumatic event, that fight, flight, freeze, fawn, that response is alive and well. And this can happen if the loss is perhaps just too overwhelming to handle at the moment, and your mind shuts down those emotions. It is all in an effort to try and keep your head above water. And if you are here listening to this podcast, I am sure you are dealing or have dealt, or somewhere along the line you've experienced some overwhelming, potentially very traumatic experience, maybe more than one. So please know I see you. I'm sending you a lot of love today. Whatever the experience is, it is yours, and it's overwhelming, and that is valid. So next on my little list here is unfinished business. So sometimes aspects of the relationship that we had with the person who's now deceased, or unresolved conflicts, can prevent the grieving process from occurring immediately. I have found, as a coach and also just observing kind of my own journey, this is where guilt and regret can come in. And in fact, I have a whole episode, by the way, if you have not tuned into this one yet, on that touches on that guilt and regret in terms of those like coulda, woulda, shoulda type of things that we often deal with. That is episode 31. Definitely go check that out if you are struggling with this right now, because oh my gosh, you guys, that guilt and that regret, that can eat us up inside. I know that feeling well. So wanted to have a whole conversation about that. So go check that episode out. It's in the show notes. But that being said, especially if someone dies very abruptly or unexpectedly, or maybe it feels before their time or they're very young, this can be a recipe for very complicated grief that lingers for a very long time. And it makes it that much more difficult to feel like we can get any closure. And with little to no closure, coping with our grief can get delayed or not happen at all. So we don't want that, right? So last point here that I just want to touch on, that I've talked about a little bit already, but there's a little bit of a distinction here that I want to call out. Perhaps there is some cultural or family pressure. So I'd be remiss if I didn't call out that some cultures or families encourage that sort of keeping it together vibe during loss, or perhaps even reward those who stay strong. I want to hold space for that, and I want to honor that, whatever your culture or your background is. But I do encourage and empower you to seek out the appropriate help for that. Have those outlets, because I've seen this more times than I would care to count. When we don't have those healthy outlets, when we don't have someone to talk to, when we don't have the right support around us, or we don't have the right support group, we have all of this pressure coming down on us, and we have grief that we're trying to cope with ourselves, but we feel like we can't release it. That can be a recipe for many, many issues down the line, physically, mentally, spiritually, all the things. So I always want to tread carefully with that. I understand different cultures, embrace different beliefs and things, but that does not mean that you do not deserve or should seek out the right help or support that is hopefully in line with those beliefs. There's always a balance. I'm a true believer in that. With grief, it's one of those things, it just like almost waits for an opening. It just waits for a moment when you are less guarded or less busy, and it surfaces, and it can just catch you so off guard. So let's just quickly run through some ways that this can manifest, because it can manifest in a variety of ways, which can often be confused with other psychological or emotional issues. Of course, physical symptoms, headaches, fatigue, insomnia, digestive issues. These can all be physical expressions of unresolved grief. And for me personally, I noticed this really showed up as tension in my neck and shoulders, which is very common, I think, for a lot of people. But I've also seen those digestive issues in people that I've worked with. And it's when you can just find an outlet, even just 5 to 10 minutes a day, to do something that helps you process and cope and release some of the things that you are feeling that are building up. I cannot even tell you the magic that will bring to your life, and it will slowly help some of these physical ailments that we might see, but also all the more reason to get ahead of it too, right? We don't even want these physical ailments to come knocking at our door if we can avoid it. So emotional outbursts as well. Those emotions, they have to go somewhere. So these intense emotional reactions, seemingly unrelated to current events, can indicate that past grief is resurfacing. So again, with where delayed grief is concerned, maybe you don't even realize that you haven't coped with something properly, or maybe you thought you did, or it's just, you just didn't even realize how much you really, pushed it down in a way. It's very common for emotional outbursts to occur, whether we're just being a little bit testy with someone, or we're just in a bad mood, or we kind of find ourselves like just getting upset or sad or angry for maybe not no reason, but you're like, oh my God, why? I just feel off. I feel like I am just snapping at everybody. What is this? It could be that. I have had clients in the past that have expressed that to me, and they're like, I don't want to be this person. I don't want to be this person for myself, for my family members. It's not fair to any of us, but like, I am having such a difficult time getting this under control. And that's where we ultimately work through that together. And sometimes those abrupt, complex feelings seem to surface out of nowhere, or maybe you just don't associate it with a loss or some grief that you might be feeling, especially if it was a long time ago. But let me tell you, more times than not, there is something behind them. And sometimes it just takes a little digging to really get to the root of that. And this is difficult because emotions can run so high, and truthfully, sometimes we just can't help what comes out. I understand that. Sometimes we're just so beside ourselves. But there are a couple of things I want you to remember here. When it comes to taking our grief out on others, which I am guilty of doing, we need to be careful. Oftentimes, people just want to help us. They just want to support us. They just want to be able to understand even when they can't. And some might not know how. And some might do it in questionable ways. But no matter what, we have to be cautious. We have to be conscientious of that, which I know is a big ask as we're grieving. So again, I just encourage maintaining as much of a level-headed mind as possible, especially for those who are just trying to help or be supportive. Just checking in with yourself and doing your best to remember exactly that. They're just trying to make you feel better, just like you would want to probably help them feel better too if the tables were turned. It's no one's fault that we've lost what we have on paper, in theory, okay, right? This is situational, but they are human beings, just like any of us, who deserve to be treated with love and respect. And, so if this is your partner, if it's one of your kids maybe, or it's just somebody that is maybe saying or doing just the wrong thing, but perhaps there's well-meaning behind it. If you do find yourself a bit agitated, annoyed, or testy with them, express it. That is the best thing you can do, because I understand sometimes it's hard to get those emotions under control. We do need to. That's why it's important to cope. It's why it's important to get help. But listen, we're not always in our right mind when we're grieving, right? So communication is absolutely critical. So even if you can't pinpoint or express exactly what you're feeling, even if you can't define it, just acknowledge it. Acknowledge that you're feeling off. Acknowledge that you're just like, I am just not feeling like myself. I wish I was. I wish I wasn't feeling this way. I am working on it, but please just know that I'm dealing with a lot right now. I have a lot on my plate. I have a lot on my heart and my mind. I'm doing my best, and I'm very sorry if I take that out on you at all. I don't mean to. Whatever we can say, right? Just so they're aware of what we're feeling and what we're going through. Sometimes that's all we can do. And also, if you find yourself in an especially emotional place, this might sound counterintuitive, but I encourage you, tap into that. Do not push that away. I am empowering you to confront that and ask yourself, okay, what is really at the root of this? Is it that you're missing your person? Is it something that they would do or say? Is it a mannerism or a habit that they had? I could go on here, but think about it. And don't just get below the surface level. It's beyond just, I miss my loved one. I just miss them. And maybe it's all encompassing, right? Maybe you are just missing their presence and everything they brought to your life. But this is where I encourage you to journal on this. Talk it out in a voice memo to yourself, just to get it out. You know what I mean? Because these emotions can come on very strong and very quickly. So when they do, that's the best time to find a good outlet to walk, go on a run, listen to music, whatever it is. And when you're doing this, be sure to take really big, deep, intentional breaths to calm yourself down and to work through this moment, because it is a moment in time, and you are going to feel joy again, and you are going to feel happiness again, and you're going to feel calm and peace again too. And I am always amazed at what just 3 or 4 breaths in through your nose and out through your mouth can do for you. By the way, if you want a little bit of help with this, I have 4 free toolkits to help guide you along with this. They are all available on my website. I'm linking them here in the show notes too, but they're completely free downloadable tools. And I really think all 4 of them can help you along in your grieving experience. So definitely go check those out. Another way that delayed grief can manifest is depression and anxiety. So delayed grief may contribute to the development of one or both of these as that underlying grief and those emotions remain unaddressed. This is when seeking that professional help that I mentioned earlier multiple times is key. And the reason I think, especially with depression and anxiety, it's really helpful to talk about it. It's talking to someone who, number one, understands it. So when you are looking for a mental health professional or a grief coach or whoever, maybe seek someone out that has been through the same or a similar loss to you. And even though all of our journeys are different, of course, just because I lost my mom and someone else lost theirs doesn't mean we're necessarily on the exact same page. But overall, we can relate to each other on this, soulful level, right? So finding someone who can understand you the best they can. And number 2, who is specifically trained to help you cope. That's just critical. And I don't want you to deny yourself that gift. And just a friendly reminder here, my membership is here for you to help support you. I offer one-on-one coaching, but also perhaps a therapist or a counselor is better for you, especially if there is more deep-rooted pain and things to work through in your past, or maybe there's childhood trauma here that is contributing to all of this. Whatever the best help is for you, but especially with that depression and anxiety, you might just need a little bit more than maybe just a daily meditation and a journaling practice. Okay. Those are 2 of my absolute favorites, but it's recognizing when you need more help. And like I said, giving yourself that gift when you need it. Another way this can manifest is through loss of interest. So it is no secret that our zest for life often goes right out the window when we lose a loved one. If we're going through a divorce, we're feeling this loss of identity. I mean, whatever primary or secondary loss you are going through, we can all feel this. And a loss of interest in activities that we once enjoyed can be a sign that suppressed grief is affecting your emotional state. This is what I am all about, you guys, right? Rediscovering a vibrant, meaningful, intentional life after loss that is full of things that spark joy for you, that bring you light and laughter and so much more. And like I said, I have resources here that can help you get there. But listen, if you are not ready for that, simply know that a loss of interest, like a severe loss of interest, can be a telltale sign that your grief is lingering in a less than healthy way. And that is something that we just want to make sure we're getting a hold of. So again, plenty of resources to help you with that if you need it. Last couple of things here, avoidance of reminders. So for example, if you go out of your way to avoid something that reminds you of your loved one, photos, places, maybe certain conversations, it could be a sign that grief is lingering beneath the surface. And I have definitely worked with people, and at the beginning, typically, of when I start one-on-one coaching with people, they are totally in a state of avoidance, avoiding, like I said, those photos, those places, maybe it's certain music. Like they just literally cannot even begin to imagine going near any of those things. And typically it's often because grief has not been acknowledged and recognized and coped in the way that it should be. So all in due time, though, and I typically find that this avoidance of things that remind us of our loved ones do tend to happen kind of more in the beginning. I think just because it's so raw, there's still shock. It's still very fresh. We just can't even bring ourselves to go there. Time does help. I will never say time heals all wounds, because it does not, right? The grief work does. Doing those things to help you along little by little each day. That is what's going to move the needle for you. There's plenty of ways to do this. I've touched on some today, so I won't belabor that, but just recognize, if you haven't before, that if you or someone you know is like really avoiding certain reminders like this, it could be a sign that there's more going on that needs to be addressed. Hey, my friend, are you needing some relief from your grief? If so, I have an exciting new offering that will help you get exactly that. My 14-day Relief in Your Grief Challenge brings you powerful, impactful, bite-sized daily content alongside the perfect meditation. One of the biggest struggles I hear from my members, clients, and people on social media is that they just need some relief from the stress, sadness, and pain that grief and loss can cause. But here's the thing. So many people are lost and unsure about where to start. This can feel like a huge thing to tackle, so we are doing it together, and we're starting with just 14 days. Give me 2 weeks and I will help you begin to take that anxiety, heartache, and anguish and turn it into peace, clarity, and hope as you move forward with your grief. Seriously, what do you have to lose by joining? Challenge your grief and give yourself some relief, my friend. I have no doubt this 14 days will be an inspiring, uplifting, perspective-changing experience for you. Join now through the link in the show description. And last but not least here, and again, you guys, I'm probably missing some things here, okay? Like I said, we only have so much time here today, so scratching the surface. But also, numbness is another way that delayed grief can manifest. So this prolonged sense of emotional numbness or detachment can also be a sign and a form of delayed grief, especially if you feel disconnected from others or even from yourself. And this numbness and this detachment, not uncommon, okay? And I'll be honest with you, like in my earlier days of grieving, I definitely detached myself a little bit from people. I definitely went through sort of like a numbing phase, and not that I used things to numb myself. I didn't do drugs, not alcohol, nothing like that. It just was like, I just didn't want to feel sometimes because I was exhausted and it was sad and I just wanted a freaking break. But I think where we need to, again, it's all about balance. It's remembering that like when these things start to go on a little bit long, and there's no time frame here. Okay. So that's why I know grief is very confusing and it's hard to identify some of these things sometimes and be like, okay, you might be like, okay, Tara, well, how long is too long? only you really know that, but I see people that are years out and they're still stuck and they're still detached and they're still numb. And, eventually with time and with the right help, it's not going to go away overnight, right? But there are ways that we can inch ourselves out of it. And that's what we want to see. We want to see a little bit of progress there. And the heaviness and the darkness to slowly start to lift. That's what that's going to look like. That's what that's going to feel like. And that does vary by person. But if you are seeing that in yourself, that it is just not lifting, or if you are seeing someone around you where it's just not lifting, that's a sign where, again, more work and some more attention to that might need to come into play. Okay, so just to start finishing up this episode, let's just talk about a few coping strategies. I've touched on definitely a few here so far. So where do we begin, right? With coping with grief that is delayed and maybe sometimes really delayed. Let's talk about it. Let's get into it. First and foremost, as I've alluded to throughout this episode, we have to start by recognizing and acknowledging the presence of delayed grief. And this is tough because we don't even realize that this is the culprit sometimes. But here's the thing. Self-awareness allows you to create space for the emotions to emerge. The first step is simply recognizing that you are feeling that grief, that what you are feeling is grief. And it can be really helpful to say very point blankly, this is grief and it's okay to feel it now. Okay, this is me feeling my grief. This is me feeling XYZ. This is me feeling anger. This is me feeling deep pain and sorrow. This is me feeling loneliness. Okay, let me take a deep breath. This is what this feels like. Defining it, naming it, and let it out. Another way to cope is allowing yourself that time and space. I've already touched on this. I won't get too deep here, but just like grief that happens immediately after loss, delayed grief needs space and time to be felt. So give yourself permission to slow down and sit with your feelings. And there's many ways that you can do that. Another coping tool, separate but related here, is through journaling or creative expression. Writing can be a very powerful outlet for expressing what words alone might not capture. Writing about your feelings and memories as well associated with whatever loss that you're coping with can help process emotions that have been ignored or suppressed. And I do have something here to kind of help with this. If you are not aware of this already, I have my Losses Become Gains daily journal. It's a wonderful tool for this. And I also purposely designed it to have both a section for free writing, but it's also prompted. The reason I did this is because for me personally, free writing can feel a bit intimidating sometimes. Like you just have this blank page staring back at you. So the guided journaling method is tailored, again, specifically to grievers, but it's general enough that really anyone can use this journal and enjoy it. But it really allows you to come at your grief and things that you are struggling with right now from all sides. Takes literally 5 minutes a day to do. It's just a beautiful, beautiful practice. And it's just meant to help set you up for just a little more success throughout the day. It's that great check-in. It's, like I said, that self-awareness piece. It's a wonderful tool for that. So that being said, you can check that out and learn more through the link in the show notes. But I also just mentioned other creative outlets. So engaging in activities such as art, music, other forms of writing outside of journaling, that can be a wonderful channel for expressing very complex emotions. And honestly, I mentioned kind of, zoning out, numbing out a little bit, finding healthy distractions. All of that and more are beautiful ways to do that, whatever resonates with you. And similar to mindfulness and meditation practices, it can be very, very healing. And like I said, great distraction and very cathartic. And we can also, even if not on purpose, get to the root of a lot of our grief through these creative outlets because it can bring a lot of peace, a lot of clarity, and it's just a great way to get whatever is going on in here. I'm all up around my head right now. If you can't see me, if you're not watching the video version of this, it's a great way to take what is going on in our head and get it out, even just for a little while. Another great coping tool is just having a ritual for remembering. So creating a ritual to honor your loved one can give you that sense of closure, but also help you keep them in their memory alive. Whether it's visiting their favorite place, maybe it's lighting a candle, you're creating a photo album, whatever creative way you want to do this that feels right to you, it's a way to reconnect and honor their memory in a really tangible way. And sometimes that tangible thing, that thing that we can hold with us, it just, material things, man, I don't know, they can help us feel closer to our loved ones sometimes, and that's perfectly okay. And that's a beautiful way to do that. So I've mentioned this multiple times, therapeutic support and talking it out. So whether it is with a therapist, a friend, a family member, trusted confidant, talking about your loss can help you process those emotions that have been bottled up. Do not underestimate the power of sharing your story and hearing it aloud. If your grief feels overwhelming, or if you are struggling to navigate it on your own, a therapist, a counselor, a grief coach like myself, we can all be really valuable guides. And it just offers you a safe space to unpack your feelings and process them at your own pace. That's also really, really important here because, like I was saying earlier, if you are having outside forces or maybe even things that you're imposing on yourself, making you feel like you have to move it along, it's just so much pressure that you don't need, right? So it's all about slowing down, taking it a step at a time. And another coping tool I just want to bring up here quickly is, like I said, mindfulness and meditation. And speaking of slowing down and taking some breaths, practices like mindfulness techniques, meditations, visualization exercises can help you become more attuned to your emotions and ultimately help you along in your healing experience. And ultimately, when it comes to grief, let's be real, we can often live in the past, or we might often worry about the future. And it's really important to hone in on a routine and, a mindfulness or a meditation practice to help bring ourselves back to that present moment, to focus on what is in front of us, to relax our mind and body, to prevent those physical ailments that I mentioned earlier, and understand and realize what is within our control. And I also just want to remind you, I have my Relief in Your Grief. I call it a challenge, but it's really more of an experience because I don't want something to sound more challenging than what you're already going through. That's challenging enough. But I call it a challenge as something that's meant to inspire you. It's a beautiful 14-day experience where each day you get a brand new meditation or breathing practice. And on a daily basis, we also dig into some important topic around grief and the healing experience and moving forward. And it's all meant to help you find some, again, peace and clarity and support in your journey. So that is also linked in the show notes. It's a wonderful resource. It's so easy to do. You can do it on your own time. It's really affordable. And it's one of my favorite things I've ever created. It's such a cool little 2-week experience. And it's just a great place for you to start if you're just feeling like you need some relief in your grief. So just to tie this all up, I feel like I just need to say for the umpteenth time that grief is not something that we get over, quote unquote. It is something that we learn to carry. And delayed grief, while it is challenging, doesn't mean that you have failed in your healing process. And remember, it is a process. It is not a journey with an end or a destination. If anything, it's a sign that your mind and body are giving you kind of a second chance to mourn in a way that you weren't able to before. And that is a really beautiful thing. That is a gift. And the healing experience from delayed grief is about compassion. It is about compassion for yourself and your unique process. And remember, it is not linear, and that is okay. This grief, it's going to come up, it's going to ebb, it's going to flow, it's going to do all the things, whether you like it or not. But what matters is that you find your way at your own pace to honor both your loss and the life that you continue to live, because you do continue living after loss. You can. That is what this podcast is all about. It's to help you do that in the most incredible way. And delayed grief is nothing if not a reminder that the human heart has its own timeline for healing. And while it might catch us off guard, it is a testament to the depth of our emotions and the complexity of the human experience, which is such a beautiful thing, you guys. I know it doesn't always feel that way sometimes. I know it's exhausting. I know you wish you could just like tap out for a minute, but I'm here for you. We are all here for you. We are here as a community to uplift you and inspire you and keep you going. And by acknowledging this grief, especially delayed grief, and seeking those the coping mechanisms I've been talking about, we can pave the way for a more holistic healing process, and one that you are going to be so proud of and so inspired by at the end of the day. And each of us have our own unique ways of healing and coping. So I encourage you to get curious, dare I say even have some fun on this journey, learn about yourself, get to know yourself again, and embracing delayed grief, any grief really, delayed or not, with patience and with that compassion that I cannot stop talking about. It is a crucial step towards reclaiming that emotional well-being that you are so deserving of and finding that renewed sense of peace. So remember, this podcast, everything else I offer here at Losses Become Gains, is here to support you on a variety of griefy topics. I really hope this episode and this topic was helpful for you today. If you enjoyed it or if it resonated with you, please share it or share this podcast with someone else who might need it. I just am on a mission to help as many grievers as I can through this very tumultuous and crazy, crazy experience that we are all part of, that touches so many of us and will touch all of us at some point in our lives. So all the more reason to have as many resources as possible, right? So thank you so much for hanging out with me today, sending you all of the light and love as always. And with that, I will see you in the next episode. I am sending you a huge thank you for tuning into today's episode, my friend. I'm so grateful you're here and for the steps you are taking to heal your heart, open your mind, fulfill your soul, learn, grow, and evolve, and move through this crazy thing called life in big, beautiful, impactful ways. Visit lossesbecomegains.com for my blog, ways to work with me, to shop my daily journal, and so much more. And be sure you're following along on Instagram and Facebook at Life with Grief Podcast. I love seeing new faces, meeting new people, hearing your stories, and supporting you however I can. Be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. If you haven't left a rating or review, please do so. I would so appreciate it. Or if you feel so inclined, to share this episode or this podcast with someone who could use it too. I'll catch you in the next episode.